The debt-to-GDP ratio measures a country's national debt compared to its gross domestic product, or GDP. It indicates how capable a country is of paying off its debt with its economic output. A lower ratio is typically seen as favorable, while a higher ratio can signal economic risk. The debt-to-GDP ratio serves as a crucial economic health indicator, reflecting a country's financial stability. It influences investor confidence, affecting interest rates and investment decisions. Additionally, it's a vital tool for risk assessment, helping to identify countries at risk of debt default. Let's look at the top 20 economies by GDP and their debt-to-GDP ratios, starting with the United States, with a GDP of $25.5 trillion and a debt-to-GDP ratio of 123%. China follows with a GDP of $17.7 trillion and a debt-to-GDP ratio of 68%. Japan's GDP stands at $5.1 trillion, but its debt-to-GDP ratio is significantly higher at 266%. Germany has a GDP of $4.2 trillion with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 70%. The United Kingdom's GDP is $3.2 trillion, and its debt-to-GDP ratio is 95%. India comes next with a GDP of $3.1 trillion and a debt-to-GDP ratio of 86%. France's GDP is $2.9 trillion with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 115%. Italy has a GDP of $2.1 trillion and a high debt-to-GDP ratio of 155%. Canada's GDP is $2 trillion with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 90%. South Korea reports a GDP of $1.8 trillion and a debt-to-GDP ratio of 47%. Russia has a GDP of $1.7 trillion with a remarkably low debt-to-GDP ratio of 18%. Brazil's GDP is $1.6 trillion and its debt-to-GDP ratio stands at 89%. Australia also has a GDP of $1.6 trillion, but a lower debt-to-GDP ratio of 50%. Spain shows a GDP of $1.4 trillion with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 120%. Mexico's GDP is $1.3 trillion with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 61%. Indonesia follows with a GDP of $1.2 trillion and a debt-to-GDP ratio of 37%. The Netherlands has a GDP of $1.1 trillion and a debt-to-GDP ratio of 52%. Saudi Arabia's GDP is $900 billion with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 34%. Turkey has a GDP of $800 billion and a debt-to-GDP ratio of 38%. Lastly, Switzerland's GDP is $800 billion with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 42%. Let's delve into the world of debt-to-GDP ratios. A good ratio generally is one that remains below 60%, which is considered healthy. On the other hand, risky ratios, those above 100%, can indicate potential financial instability and a higher risk of default. Now, let's look at some at-risk economies. Japan, with a staggering ratio of 266%, holds the highest among major economies, posing significant risks. Italy is not far behind, with a ratio of 155%, facing substantial economic challenges. Over in the United States, a ratio of 123% raises concerns about its long-term fiscal health. In conclusion, the debt-to-GDP ratio is a critical metric for assessing economic health and stability. Countries with high ratios face increased risks, while those with lower ratios are generally seen as more financially stable. Understanding these ratios helps gauge economic resilience and potential vulnerabilities.